Probably. So hello, live audience, and hello, online audience. How are you today? I have a few questions since we're a small group and we can make this last presentation a little bit interactive and get to know each other. I was curious to hear from you. How many of you work with museums already or with objects? You do? Okay, so a minority. Maybe later we can talk more about who you're interacting with. Um, and my second question is, how many of you work with young learners? I'm saying pre-K, elementary. Yay, elementary. Okay, so hi. All right, so now that we know this, we've heard about adults, we've heard about older learners, we are ourselves, I imagine, museum visitors and consumers of culture and makers of culture in some way. And so now I'll be talking about pre-K4 students and their interactions with objects and with museum objects at the museum, specifically at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. So I need to warn you that we're going to read the voices of the students. I have to warn you that this presentation is going to contain a large amount of cuteness, the kind of cuteness, but also wisdom and sheer enthusiasm for learning that only maybe 4-year-olds are capable of, right? So we're going to hear voices, and we're going to hear how they negotiate meanings, sometimes uncomfortable hypotheses, what they hypothesize, what they think about when they look at object and interact physically with their all senses with objects. And samples, basically samples of deep learning, right? So what Anne was mentioning before with the cycles of deep learning and what Teresa and Monica were mentioning before with the Lidicott and Scarino notions of observing, noticing, describing, analyzing, interacting, critiquing. So we're going to see that in action. And for that, that's going to be the purpose of this conversation. All right, so let's meet our participants. Oh yeah, I forgot to say, I'm going to try to make this presentation a little interactive, and I chickened out of the idea that I had to do a live survey. But thinking of our online audience, I will send you the codes to participate in the online survey, while for the live audience, we could just do a show of hands and do it in a more old school way. Okay. So here are the members, the participants in this pre-K4 dual language classroom. It's a private school, privileged private school in the New York City area. And as you can see, there are 9 children in this class. They're all multilingual speakers. They use multiple and various home languages. That includes Wolof, Hungarian, Russian, Mandarin, Danish, French, and English. So there's a whole, this is a very linguistically and culturally diverse classroom in which plurilingualism is highly valued and kind of normalized in the way. These are children, this is their first year in a school, and all their classmates are just like them, using several languages. So I'll be brief in the theoretical frameworks. We've already talked about that, and it's shared with my colleagues. But for this project with pre-K4 students, I'm also drawing on aspects of multiple literacies because it's highly relevant in this classroom with 4-year-olds, because they're engaging with multiple modes of meaning on a daily basis in the classroom, but they're not yet reading written texts. They're reading a lot of other texts, visual texts, and manipulating text, but they're not reading written text. And lastly, I also draw on research and praxis coming, of course, from early education and early language education. So I mentioned that before, preschool classroom. And to give you a little bit more of context, since we're going to enter their world for a couple of minutes, the school mascot, the class mascot, and his name is Pilou. So Pilou went on a trip around the world. And he sends postcards, usually at the beginning of a unit, right? But he sends postcards to the classroom to give them news and to share with them what he sees on his travels. And when we're entering this classroom, Pilou went on a trip and he sent a postcard. And so before even reading the note that is written on the postcards, the children will observe the picture on the card and try to collectively determine where Pilou could be. So the question is, where is Pilou? And we're also going to try to figure it out together. Okay. So here is the picture on the postcard. So for those of you who are online and remote, if you go to www.menti.com and you use the code 289068, you can enter your answers to this little trivia quiz. And for all of us in the audience, I don't know if you're familiar with the HQ live trivia show that is all the rage these days, with articles in New York Times. Live shows are back. That's a new change. 9 p.m. East Coast time, every day is a trivia. And so we're going to do it in the spirit of HQ. So based on this picture, try to think for a second, where do you think Pilou is? Which continent? Is it in Asia? Is he in Asia? Is he in Africa? Is he in the Americas? What do you think? Africa? Yeah? Is that a consensus? Well, I'll look at the Menti results later to check out what your ideas were. Well, you're correct. Pilou is in Africa. And specifically, he is in Senegal, in Dakar, which is the capital. Actually, the monument, the statue that you see here, it's called the African Renaissance Monument, Le Monument de la Renaissance Africaine. It's the bronze statue that was built by a Korean company and inaugurated in 2010, and that since then has been quite controversial with respect to the landscape, but also the choices, the artistic choices that were made, and the role, the symbolic dimension of this particular monument. So the children, like us, right, are negotiating visual and symbolic meanings. They're trying to think about where Pilou could be, and one of the main hypotheses is in Africa. And then they gather together in small groups. This is not the end of this introductory task on trying to figure out what Pilou is. They gather in small groups. You see them here at tables, and they're looking at different other pictures that Pilou included in his letter. And they're to go further in their interpretation of those and trying to think about what the meanings associated with that. And so among the pictures are those two, right? So the children are observing, they're comparing, they're analyzing, they're reflecting, and they're sharing together. The teacher is not monitoring those conversations, right? And so one student in the small group was looking at this first picture of a village, and then she looked at it and she said, "Oh, ça ressemble pas du tout au Sénégal." She is from Senegal. She visits Senegal every summer, and she looks at this first picture and says, "It doesn't look like Senegal at all." But when she examined the second one, the urban one, which is a picture of the city of Dakar, she was just like, "Yeah, when I go to Senegal, it's more like this," right? So right away, the children were comparing notes, right? Probably just like you did by yourself. And they were confronted with the experiences and the views of others. And these views might actually be different from the ones they had initially. And that happened through dialogue that was not controlled or mediated or scaffolded by the teacher. It was free conversation. So it was driven by students themselves, and it was also building in the students' funds of knowledge, right? Because we have a vast funds of knowledge in the classroom. So this is a very small step that I wanted to share with you about different ways that you can create a space for intercultural dialogue and work on uncovering meaning potentials associated with a picture here. But what I wanted to underline here is that from a praxis perspective, we always tend to think that very young learners don't have enough language to talk about their experiences or culture even. But this is actually showing that with very little language, you can participate and contribute to the conversation in the classroom. Okay, so let me continue. So the unit unfolds more or less in a similar fashion. I'll go very briefly on this. So the unit, of course, is about Senegal. It's during the Francophone week in the school. And it will include a visit to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. So they do a lot of activities with objects and through objects. They did a sound bingo with traditional musical instruments that they had to recognize. They also did the same kind of sound bingos with contemporary music from Senegal. They worked with fabrics and dresses that were collected from community members, local artists and families from the school. They created a 3D representation, they crafted a 3D representation of a village that was based on the work of a visual artist from Senegal who visited their classroom and helped them sculpt those objects as well. They read a lot of books about stories about Senegal. They listened to a lot of stories about Senegal and traditional contes Senegalese. They created their own gallery exhibitions with all the objects they had gathered from the community, from their families, from their friends, and they presented this exhibition to their older peers. So they actually presented to the kindergartners, the first graders, and fifth graders, and to their parents on a parent night. So they did a lot of activities with and around objects, manipulating, creating, and having all sorts of different sensory experiences, right? And right in the middle of the unit, there was a field trip to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and specifically to the African art collection, which is in a couple of rooms at the museum. And they were divided in small groups that day at the museum. Groups of 3 or 4 with an adult who was accompanying them, and they had a mission. They had a task. They had to find, in those 2 or 3 rooms, they had to find several objects. They had to find a mask, a statue, a piece of jewelry, fabric, costume, and a weapon. So we're going to go together, and we're going to try to decide and to help them out on this mission of theirs. Okay, so here is another little trivia moment. I'm asking you to look carefully at those 3 reproductions of objects from the museum collections, and to tell me which one of those 3 is a mask. So I'm letting you think for a second. And those of you who are online, and if you want to participate, you can also go back to the Menti website that I mentioned, and if you use the code 198829, you can also vote and decide which one is a mask. You have to choose just one, yeah. It's a clue. I know, it's hard, huh? Any ideas? The far right, the one on the far right? Is there a consensus? Yeah? Okay, you are correct. This is a mask, right? It is from the Nalu people in the Niger River region. So the same way you were negotiating the meaning of mask a moment ago, the children also had to figure out what a mask is. And so they thought, probably like many of you, that a mask usually covers the face, right? But this one seems to cover the whole body, right? It has fabric, it has different, it's made of different materials, or at least part of it would be the whole body of a small child, for sure. Maybe not of an adult. Uh, so they had to revise this definition of what a mask is in light of the objects they had before them. And they did that in French or in English or in a mix of those two, and together by engaging in dialogue. So initially, the student S thought that it was a costume. He was very excited. Look, I found it. I found a costume. It's here. But then he looked at the label next to this artifact, and he recognized the word mask from the cartel, right? Probably because they've seen it a lot written in the classroom, but he recognized it, and he was just like, so this is a mask? It's written mask right here. So he asked the adult to read the label for him, for the group. He was just like, that's also a mask? And then they're negotiating the rest of the rest of the label. And I was like, but it's different from the other masks that we saw. It's bigger, yes, and it's not only the face, it's the whole, all over, all of it, right? So it's they had to learn to identify the differences between the various objects that they saw under the same label, mask, right? And contrasting the objects. Then they continued to compare, but this time they compared it, of course, to the mask they know and the ones they use, such as the Halloween, the mask, I think it was Spider-Man. I thought it was Superman, but it is the mask of Spider-Man. And the little girl said, yeah, my mask has feathers and glitter on it. Not this one. Very different. Okay? So they're negotiating that. They're comparing with their own, the mask they're aware of. Student A thought that the mask was used for special dances. So already orienting towards the practice associated with the particular mask, the banda mask that we just saw. Also because they had seen a video of a ceremony, a dance ceremony, where the performers were wearing masks that were different from this one, but they already associated mask and dance performance together. And K and C here associate the practice of wearing masks with, of course, Halloween and Carnaval, right? So the different tattoo. So they continued negotiating meanings of masks that they encounter other artifacts, but I'll come back to this one a bit later. Okay. All right. So this object here, I mean, you probably don't see it very well, but it is not a mask. It is a headdress. You put it on top of your head. But all the children were very intrigued by the crocodile shape of the headdress, and especially the teeth. So the conversation about tooth and teeth came back so often in the classroom, and especially in debriefing. So it's as you can imagine. And so one student was just, they were looking at the mask and the teeth and how it's scary for little children. And then, you know how young people, sometimes adults do that too. They start free associating and they start telling you a story that they're familiar with, right? Okay. So they started doing that. And the teacher let that happen and let that unfold in the conversation. So one of the kids, C, said, yeah, my sister lost a tooth. And that started a whole conversation about what happens to your teeth once they fall. And as you can imagine, for a young person, losing a tooth is a super big event. It's really big, and when you come to think of it, you're kind of losing a part of your body. So it has implications. It's really important for preschoolers. They also related the tooth to the notion of weapon, because they thought this was a weapon at the beginning. One little girl was like, yeah, it's a weapon, it has teeth. Because they can use their own teeth. I mean, they know they can use their teeth as a weapon, but they're not allowed to use their teeth as a weapon. But so they were associating and going through this journey. So here comes the question: what happens to your tooth that you've just lost? So using English and French, they start negotiating and trying to find answers. And we're reaching here a little intercultural moment in the lives of those 4-year-olds. Because they start making, hypotheses. So in English, C explains that the tooth fairy comes. That's what happens. But M is very skeptical, and then he says, I don't think so. And then later, he's like, no, the tooth fairy doesn't exist. So that's very clear, it's very clear. But in turn, at some point, T intervenes, and she's in French, and she said, it's not a fairy, it is a mouse. Because in French, it's a little mouse that comes to take your tooth and leaves a little coin, right? The same work that the tooth fairy does, but in French, it's a mouse, okay? And then A tries a middle ground. She's trying to find a way in between and say, I think it's an animal that has wings, like a butterfly, because it needs to go places. So it's not a mouse, it's not a fairy, but it has wings. It might be a butterfly. And then they're having this informal conversation that is very important to them, and the teacher jumps in. And she says, well, I think it's the sun that takes the tooth. The teacher is from Morocco, and in her family and in her traditions, it's the sun that is very strong that takes the tooth once you've lost it. And then the other teacher in the room, who is from Algeria, she says, no, it's the earth. The earth takes the tooth. For me, it's the earth that takes the tooth, because you have to bury it once you lose it. So all of a sudden, there are not 2 possible answers to the question, but there are 4. And so the teacher acknowledges this, right? And she asks students what they think. And so M thinks that, well, no, yeah, it's the little mouse, no doubt about it. But the student S concludes by saying, it's kind of strange, right? And there was no resolution that day, right, in terms of definitive answers to the mystery of the lost tooth. But instead, there were several hypotheses, right? They emerged from those interactions. And in the process, the students learned to consider multiple answers beyond the ones that they believed are the true ones, right? So it wasn't a matter of about truth. It was a matter of listening to each other and trying to figure out that there are other ways of looking at this and thinking about this, and working together to solve problems. And that, I feel, is a big part of the kinds of intercultural experiences at the level, of course, of 4-year-olds, that we can offer our students, right, to work together to solve problems, so different kinds of problems that are differently relevant to you at different points, after a visit at the museum. And be reassured that this conversation was continued in the classroom and further negotiated, because the following week after the museum visit, a dentist came to visit the classroom, and we could revisit this whole conversation together a little bit longer. Okay, I have one more example, but I don't really have a lot of time. I'll take the couple of minutes, right? Here is another piece of trivia. It's another trivia question. This artifact is hanging vertically in one of the rooms of the Met, at the Met. And I have a question for you. I agree, it's a bad picture, but what do you think this could be made of? Candy wrappers? That's possible. Right. Huh? Mixed media. Mixed media could be, right? Do you have this notion of a sort of weaving, right? So maybe fabric, maybe threads. some wood or straws, grass, right? So we're thinking of a lot of material that um, make you think about weaving, right? Well, it's actually metal. All of it is metal, right? I know. And it's a contemporary piece, right? It's a contemporary piece, and I'm going to give you a little bit more detail. From Elana Tsui, who's a Ghanaian artist, and it's aluminium, copper, and wire. So if you're, and it's gorgeous, full of colors. The kids, the students were very attracted to this piece because of the multiple colors. And interestingly, they thought it was, you remember they were supposed to look for fabric? So they thought it was a fabric. It was fabric. So we looked at it closely. But interestingly, one of the students said, it's hanging vertically. But one of the students said, no, it's a carpet. I think it's a carpet. And then we had this whole conversation about, oh yeah, what do you think it's a carpet? And then it was just like, well, because it's to sleep on it. And then he was probed to further. I mean, like, so do you sleep? What do you think? Why do you think it's for sleeping? And then he evoked it. He said, because I know that in China, they have carpets to sleep on. And the student S is actually his mother is Chinese and grew up in Guadeloupe, a francophone island, right? And he's traveled to China several times. So, but he's also saying, oh yeah, but that was a long time ago that people did that in China. They don't do that anymore. His sense of time is probably a little distorted, which is always interesting. But so again, the negotiation of the materials and the meanings associated with this contemporary piece brought about funds of knowledge about what you do with a carpet, because what do you do with a carpet? Other students say, well, you play on it, you walk on it, you learn on a carpet, because they do circle time when they have to sit on the carpet. But S was like, you sleep on a carpet, like in China, like in my family. So I thought that was interesting, and further negotiation occurred. So to wrap it up, as we've seen, objects and museum objects in particular offer multiple opportunities to engage with the materiality of languages and cultures, but also conflate time and space, and invite an inquiry stance. We kind of want to know. We want to know more. We want to ask questions. And what really matters most here are not necessarily the answers, right? That's what I was sharing with you earlier. But instead, what matters are the questions that are being asked and the collaborative scaffolding of interpretations. So I'll end this presentation here, and we can talk more later. We can have more discussion. And just a note on how we're going to continue this symposium, since we have some more time to spend together. We're going to have our Q&A right now, but then we would like to invite you to join us on performing a little bit of a workshop and inquiry with the objects that Anne and Monica and Teresa brought together and are on this table. So we'll do the Q&A, and then Anne would lead us through a little experience with objects, if that's okay with you. All right, thank you.